Thank you, Malcolm. And thank you for that great speech, Judy. Judy and I go way, way back, and I recognize a lot of those milestones that you were talking about. And thank you to RBF and all the partners who sponsored this wonderful event. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I have the unenviable task of being between you and lunch, so I'm going to be both short and hopefully somewhat inspiring. That's my job here today. I've also been in Singapore twice in the last 2 weeks. There seemed to be this huge, confluence of events on sustainability all of a sudden in this region. And I kind of feel that energy in the room. There's sort of a tipping point here. And because of that, we are now trying to set up a regional hub here in Singapore for GRI. We see, and I'll talk about this a little bit, a huge confluence of factors driving sustainability, not just reporting here in Southeast Asia. So I'm very excited to be here. But the key question, the question that's on the slide behind me, and the question I think we're all going to be wrestling with throughout the day is, what kind of future do we want to have? And this is the part of the speech where usually people will start going into that well-known litany of doom and gloom, sort of the increasingly dystopian narrative that we have today. I'm going to flip it a little bit. I'm going to talk about something else. Maybe some of you have read Steven Pinker's new book called Enlightenment now. Oh, well, one or two. Okay, that's great. Well, Steven Pinker's a Harvard professor. He's got a big shock of gray hair, so you know he's smart. Bill Gates said it was his favorite book of 2018, so I had to read it. And, it's quite a long book, so I'll save you some time. Basically, Pinker says things are getting better, not worse. And he looks across the span of time, he looks across the last 200 years, and he says life expectancy has more than doubled in that time. The world is much wealthier. It's about 100 times wealthier over the last 200 years. And this fact really threw me because I wasn't expecting this. But that the distribution of wealth is actually much better than it was. And just so you don't think he's sort of sandbagging you by looking at 200 years, he also looks at the last 30 years. And the statistics there are incredible. So there were, in 1988, there were 45 democracies covering about 2 billion people. And today, there are 103 democracies covering over 4 billion people. Then there were 46 oil spills. Today there are 5. And this last one is really compelling to me. Extreme poverty, the poorest of the poor, has actually dropped by more than 75% over the last 30 years. And now it's under 10%, which is great. But he warns that the values that got us here, reason, science, humanism, are all under threat today. So why do I say all this? I say all this because I think it's really important for us as a community to start with a basis of fact, to be aligned on kind of where we are as a people and what we want to do going next. And I think where we are today, that's very important because it seems that the truth is increasingly a scarce commodity. We know that the challenges ahead are enormous. You know, in my lifetime alone, world population has doubled from, more than doubled, from 3 billion to over 7 billion, and it's going to top out over 9 billion in 2015. We still have over 800 million people who go to bed hungry each night. And this week we heard that if we only have 12 years to take action to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So that famous quote from Thomas Jefferson comes to mind, which is, "Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom." If he were alive today, he would say eternal vigilance is the price of sustainability. Because things have gotten better, but we need to continue to tackle these big challenges that we have in front of us. And that's why we're all here. That's why we chose this career. This is a room full of people, and I'm really glad to see how full it is, who are dedicated to making things better. And that's what we're seeking, sustainable development. That is living our best life now, but leaving an even better life for our children and future generations. So why am I here? As you might expect, as the Chief Executive of the Global Reporting Initiative, my message is about transparency. I know that transparency can be a very powerful force for good. I worked for the last 20 years before joining GRI in the private sector, so I've seen firsthand that transparency and corporate responsibility are huge forces for good. We know, and we heard it earlier today, that you manage what you measure. And so it creates this virtuous cycle of actually putting data out in the public and then improving it before you report again. GRI is now 21 years old. It's hard to believe. It's been a movement. It started as kind of a niche. When you would say the words corporate responsibility at a cocktail party, you'd get kind of laughs. I mean, corporate and responsibility in the same sentence. But now it's mainstream. Just a couple of stats. We got some data from KPMG not too long ago that said that 92% of the largest companies, the G250, the largest 250 companies on the planet, are now reporting sustainability information, and 75% of those are using GRI to do so. The number in the S&P 500 is 85%. The number among the leaders in the World Business Council on Sustainable Development is also 85%. So when you hear all those stats, you might think, okay, what's wrong? Maybe have we hit peak sustainability reporting at this point? Well, you know, maybe we have. But I think there's a lot more that we need to do. We have terrible adoption in the small and medium-sized enterprise space. And there's probably, I've heard statistics of up to 90% of economic activity taking place in the SME space. We have quality issues. Quality is all over the map, but we have a market in sustainability reporting that's only 40% assured, and that's abysmally low. And we have the other side of the equation. If companies are putting out all this data, who's on the other end of that transaction? Who's using the information? So we have to work on the uptake by investors, capital markets, regulators, and others. And speaking of regulation, I mean, I think what's happening here in Asia is incredible. We have seen this huge uptake because the capital markets here in Singapore, in Hong Kong, Taiwan, KL, and other places have all put in listing requirements. Comply or explain, put out your sustainability report, and it's really jumped the numbers. We've seen a 500% increase in sustainability reporting in the last 6 years here. And I was joking with somebody at the cocktail party last night. It's easy to get a massive increase when you start at fairly low numbers. And frankly, the numbers are still fairly low here. So we have a lot of work to do. But just in terms of policy, to give you a sense of where that's going, GRI is tracking currently 450 transparency-related policies across the globe. 450 in over 60 countries. They split about 70-30, 70 being government and 30, but the highest growing, as capital markets. And 125 of those policies actually either reference or require GRI as the global standard for reporting. But the main message about reporting is, it's going to sound weird coming from me, it's not about the report. It's about what you do with the information to make improvement. I want to leave you with that in your mind. Before I leave, I just want to cover something that I think is important to this conference and to all of us, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. If you're not paying attention to the SDGs, then you're not paying attention. The world came together 3 years ago in New York and unanimously approved the 17 goals and the 169 targets. But as I said, GRI is 20 years old. So you've got companies, and I worked for some of these companies, that have been reporting and working on corporate responsibility that entire time. So GRI is 20, the SDGs are 3. There's 17 goals, there's 169 targets. How do we bring these things together? It's a huge challenge, and frankly, it's confusing to a lot of companies. But we know that companies, and companies I work for, are now, in terms of revenue, they're bigger than the GDP of some countries. I worked in the supply chain for Apple. I mean, I have firsthand experience to know that the value chains of these companies, and HP is certainly one of them, stretch around the world. They can have massive impact on the SDGs, so we need to work together to bring these two worlds together, and GRI has taken that on. So we have created a series of tools. I call it the Rosetta Stone for SDGs, to translate the work that companies are doing into accomplishment of the SDGs. The first one we came out with was in 2015, working with our partners at the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the UN Global Compact. We came out with the Compass, and that's just to map from one to the other. The second document was last year, and this is what I call the Bible. It's the analysis of goals and targets. So for each of the 169 goals, we know that mapping's not enough. So we created a list of actions that companies can take for each of the goals and a list of disclosures for each one of those actions. And then the third document was released just this year at the High-Level Political Forum, again with UN Global Compact, the Practical Guide. And it ties it all together, so how to prioritize, how to set goals and track performance, and finally how to report and improve your performance. So that's all been produced, and it's all freely available for you to use. But we didn't stop there. We created another document for investor-friendly SDG reporting. And this last one, I think, is maybe the most important, and it doesn't get a lot of notice. But we've created a pilot project with the government of Colombia that links government reporting on the SDGs and private sector reporting on the SDGs. And we're trying to proliferate that to other countries around the world. We think it's essential that governments and the private sector work together on the agenda, the very important agenda of the global goals. So let me just end here and just tell you that's a lot of information to digest. Sometimes we tend to, let's say, geek out together. We all know this stuff pretty well. This is kind of preaching to the converted. So I want to kind of, again, end where I started and lift you all up a little bit and remember that it's not about the report. It's about sustainable development. And we have to take stock that we are doing well, but there are huge challenges and threats, and we have to be vigilant. We know that transparency works, and it's a major engine for doing good. And in the end, it's all about that. It's about leaving a legacy of good. Those who know me for more than 5 minutes will probably see pictures of my grandchildren. So for me, this is a little personal. It's about why we chose this as our careers. It's about leaving that legacy of good. And you all, I want to thank you all because you've already made this choice. So thank you for being part of this movement. Thank you very much.